Thank you for joining the Alexandria Library for tonight's program, Staying with the Trouble, Recognizing and Attending to Climate Anxiety. As just stated, this event is being recorded and will be made available on the library's YouTube page under the Sustainability series. There will be times throughout the session where you'll be invited to unmute and share with the group. If you prefer not to be on the recording, you may want to consider leaving your video turned off and using the chat box to post your thoughts. Our speaker tonight and facilitator is Dr. Debbie Sturm. Dr. Sturm is a professor and the counseling and supervising director for the program of graduate psychology at James Madison University. She has clinical experience in group facilitation for families of cancer patients and counseling for children who are victims of violent crimes, neglect, or abuse. Her research interests include nature connectedness, sustainability and mental health, college sexual assault and Title IX, and trauma and community violence. Dr. Sturm is a member of the Climate Psychology Alliance North America and is an avid outdoorswoman and triathlete. Dr. Sturm, thank you so much for being here this evening, and I really look forward to what you have to share with us.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm going to take one quick second and share my screen so I can just give you a little bit of a guided discussion to begin with, and then there'll be a couple points where I pause and really invite you all to just share anything that comes up for you. And so hopefully I can do a number of things tonight. One is kind of introduce you to climate anxiety and help you figure out how to personalize this. Like, what does it mean for you? And also, what are some of the, I wouldn't even say solutions, because I think when we talk about climate anxiety, it's a really logical thing to feel. So maybe not a solution, but some actions or some things you can do for yourself that help make meaning of this situation. So recognizing and attending to climate anxiety. As you mentioned, I'm Debbie Sturm at James Madison University. One of the things I really value is when we understand sort of our climate story. I think we can do a little bit of personal reflection and figure out like our own story and what brings you to care about the world, to care about the environment, to really want to connect with this and to even like envision solutions as well as like sort of the catastrophes. And so for me, I grew up in a really small town in northwestern Pennsylvania named Bradford, which is the home of Zippo lighters and literally nothing else. And so but we were always outside, and my dad was a forest ranger. And so we would spend the summers camping or going to the state parks or to the national forest. And nature connectedness became a very clear part of sort of my childhood, my identity, who I am. And probably like many of you, as I got into adulthood, I got a little distant from that because of career and school and I don't know, just things that you do as an adult. And I found my way back through a book by Richard Louv called Last Child in the Woods. And if you haven't read it, I really recommend it, particularly if you have that story of a childhood really connected to the natural world and sort of roaming the woods and picking up rocks and things like that. It really brings you back to that part of your identity that is so, I don't know, it's just so woven into who we are, and we can often walk away from it or move away from it. That really brought me to this awareness of how we're so incredibly connected to the natural world for our development and our identity and our well-being. And in the counseling field, you know, we talk a lot about sort of our environment as a factor for well-being. And it really struck me that when it comes to climate change, if we're that deeply connected to the environment for our identity and for our well-being, what happens when it starts to deteriorate? And what happens when that deterioration is due to human activity or is due to like a confluence of things that all come together that we feel like we have no influence or control over? What happens when that environment starts getting lost? Places that we loved change or disappear. Parts of heritage vanish. They're burned, they're lost in a hurricane, they're lost in a flood. And so there's a real interesting piece of like, who are we when it comes to the natural world, and who are we when damage comes to her? So I encourage you to just sort of reflect as we talk about, who are you? that brings you to this connection to the natural world and brings you to the concern about climate change. All right, so what exactly is climate anxiety? The first thing I want to stress is that it's a rational and legitimate reaction to the complex reality of climate change. Sometimes we talk about anxiety in a way of like, I have anxiety around public speaking, which is a legitimate anxiety, but it's not necessarily as rational. It's not irrational, but it sort of sits somewhere on that spectrum of this is something I could fix. This is something I can sort of do some exercises around. I can do some therapy around it. I can do some cognitive behavioral treatment to work my way into not having a fear of public speaking. But with climate anxiety, this is real. This is legitimate, that we have a climate that's changing in a way that is absolute a threat to ourselves and to our future. And so being anxious about it makes perfect sense. It's also an invitation to action. When I sort of reflect on all the counseling theories that I've learned over the years, all of the counseling and psychological theories characterize anxiety as a catalyst. So kind of hold that and realize like the anxiety that you're feeling is legitimate, it's rational, and it's a catalyst. And then it's up to you, and we'll figure out how to do this, what catalyst it is for you, what direction it propels you into. And also when you feel heard and validated in your fears, in your anxiety, in your worry, it really opens up the door to considering what unique action you can take to be a catalyst for change. And for everyone, it's different. And so just allow yourself to also wonder, like, what is my anxiety about? What are the themes or the triggers or the things that really get me worried? All right. So I'll give you a little bit of research here, just 2 studies that are just pretty overwhelming, honestly, to observe and also validating. So how do we feel? 66% of Americans are somewhat or very worried about climate change. 41% feel outraged, 40% feel helpless. By the way, you can feel all of these things at the same time. 66% feel the issue is extremely important. And yet 11% worry that it's too late to do anything about it. So if you just sort of take these feelings, you can have any constellation of these, any of them. You could be very worried and feel helpless and feel like it's too late. You can be outraged, and this could be very important. You can hold anger and frustration. So know that you can hold any combination of these yourself, and that the person next to you could hold a different combination of it as well. So our feelings about this are uniquely individual, but they're also shared. What's also interesting here, and I'll sort of share this next study with you, if I can click the right button. Okay. This is very recent, and if y'all have a chance to even just sort of Google Hickman Climate Anxiety 2021, there's this massive study that's conducted among 8 European nations of over 10,000 youth, children and youth, 2 different collections, sort of an under 15 crowd and then a 16 to 25 crowd. And so what they were looking at is like, how do our children and youth feel about climate change? Number one, 80% of them felt betrayed. That's a heavy one. So whereas, you know, what we talked about on the slide before, adults have this constellation of things that are, this is important, I feel anxious, I feel worried. The number one feeling among children and youth up to age 25 was betrayal. They feel there are negative impacts on their daily functioning related to their fears of climate change. 66% felt sad and afraid. Those who lived in areas that were more affected to climate change had higher levels of distress. So these are people who have experienced the concrete, visible effect of climate change. More than half felt anxious, powerless, guilty, angry, ashamed, depressed, grief, and hurt. 56% of youth felt humanity is doomed. So we have sort of an adult, sort of a 26 and older constellation of feelings around sort of climate anxiety and sort of eco trauma and climate fears and sort of the whole collection of terms. And then we have children and youth who admittedly have a different experience with it than we do. Like for those of us, I'm 55 and I think, well, maybe I'll have 40 more years. But my nieces who are 20, they're looking at much more time on this earth and decisions about whether to have children or not. And so their experience is really sort of their metrics for their own distress is very different. But still, hold on to that betrayal. I think that's really powerful and an important thing to consider. So we do have generational differences between how people feel and what their emotional distress and relationship is to the climate crisis. So what does this mean? Climate anxiety, in addition to sort of the things I talked about, one thing that it does is it kind of psychologically invites us to do sort of one of two things. We either can be really focused on the catastrophe in a sense to where you could become paralyzed in fear. Like it's so intense, there's so much to consider, like you feel paralyzed. Or it's just too much and your psyche will shut down. A couple months ago, it wasn't a couple months ago, the pandemic just really messes with your sense of time. It was probably a year and a half ago, I participated in Al Gore's Climate Reality Project training for climate advocates. And they put us in little groups based on like our region. It was virtual and we would meet, we would watch some things and then we would meet as a group, watch some things, meet as a group. They shared a lot of the, the really intense reality of climate change, the things that are happening all over the world, things that you hadn't even thought about. And it was overwhelming. When we would get to our groups, many people would say, this is so much, I don't even know what to do. They would be kind of frozen in sort of this distress column. And then others would just be in a shutdown. Like, I can't keep looking at this. Maybe there's something better. Maybe there's solutions. And so there's sort of a way that we have these two poles that happen internally when we're examining this. For the most part, we kind of dance somewhere from midpoint towards the distress. And it's normal because factually, it is distressing. Our challenge when we're dealing with climate anxiety is to say, okay, I've got these feelings. I'm paying attention to my relationship with them. I don't want to shut down. So what do I do? And a lot of what we recommend is to consider how much is too much for you? And when do you need to sort of step back and take a break so that you don't distance yourself too far, but you know how to sort of calibrate your need. The importance of the information, the importance of staying grounded in the reality, but also the ability to sort of step back enough that you don't distance from it. So pay attention to sort of where you fall at different times with different news or different situations about these two poles. In the climate distress is the fear, anxiety, overwhelm, sadness, grief, loss, shame. A lot of the things that were listed on that front page, on that first study that I talked about. This defense against knowing is the stuff that happens to us when it's just too much and I can't know it. I just can't know anymore. I can't see anymore. I can't absorb anymore. It's too much. And sometimes we'll hear people that are close to us who will intellectualize it, or they'll talk about, I'm not sure it's really as bad as they're saying, or, it's not really happening to us. We're about to get a lot of snow. That's got to be good because we get snow in winter. And so they'll do some sort of mental games on one side to really buffer and make sure that they don't take it in too much. So we can have a whole spectrum of emotional experiences with it. This is one of my favorite. I think anytime that things have been in just real upheaval and overwhelming to me on a sort of a global scale, I read this. So I'll give you a second. And honestly, I think the reason that I gave you the second to read it instead of reading it for you is whenever I get to those last few words, my voice cracks, because I do hold the pain and the anxiety and the worry about the planet and about vulnerable people and about species, places, heritage. And so, yeah, everywhere. It's loaded, it's heavy. What I also learned from sort of the pain of something like this and really being introspective is that those emotions are typically born from a place of empathy. If we couldn't connect to the plight of the planet, if we couldn't connect to the plight of different flora and fauna, if we weren't connected to places that are so important to us, if we weren't connected to each other or to vulnerable populations, we wouldn't feel the same degree of anxiety or worry that we currently do. So for me, and I hope this resonates with you too, when I think about the anxiety and the feelings that sort of bubble up in me when I hear the word everywhere, I think this is about my empathy. This is about connection. And maybe that resonates for you. So when I finish, I'll be curious, what the idea of this being about empathy means. Empathy is really a superpower. It also connects us to pain and to loss and to grief and to fear. So empathy. And so when you think about this empathy piece, like what is it propelling you to do? When you think about your anxiety and what it brings up for you, it goes back to the question I asked a few minutes ago. What is your anxiety asking of you? What is it catapulting you towards? It's a message. Your anxiety is telling you something unique about you. All right. This is where I want you to, I'll try and slow down. I like to talk fast and say a lot of things, but in this space, in this little slide here, it's important to ask yourself your personal climate anxiety. When we are able to uncover our unique relationship with climate anxiety, we get a clearer picture of what we need. Is your fear or anxiety for future generations? Are you worried about children and grandchildren? Are you worried about people who live in a place that maybe you used to live and it's becoming a hard place to be? Do you have despair over what we've done and what we continue to do? Are you feeling a loss of a place or fearing the loss of a place or the loss of heritage? I have a wonderful, wonderful friend here at JMU. Her name is Dr. Carol Nash, and I'm just going to say it because y'all, she's the best thing in the world. But she is a cultural anthropologist and archaeologist. And she has found at this point in her career, and she's approaching retirement, that her calling is to document as many pieces of heritage as possible before they're lost to climate change. She's highly committed to Indigenous stories, legacy of enslaved peoples who have fled to different parts of our state. And so her life work right now is how do I protect things that we're about to lose for good? And so maybe loss of heritage or loss of your own story, a place that you love that's no longer safe or okay, or loss of species. What about pollution, contamination, or waste? Harm to vulnerable communities? About injustices or helplessness? So somewhere in your relationship to climate anxiety is that little piece that's so deeply personal. And when you know what your personal anxiety is related to, again, it gives you that direction. It tells you this is where I need to sort of put some energy. I was really struck. I went to a conference a couple years ago, and we had a sort of an open forum and invited people who wanted to talk about climate change and mental health to come join us. And it was so interesting to me, and this isn't like a positive or a negative. It was so interesting to me how most of the group that came, they wanted to talk about recycling. And for me, I'm deep down in this rabbit hole with like loss of place and heritage and existential stuff and like vulnerable communities. And that's where my climate pain sits. And it was almost shocking to me. And I had to like recalibrate myself in the moment and go, oh, maybe their pain sits in pollution and waste and contamination. So I had to just remember like our pain, our personal fears all sit in a different place. And maybe that's good because there's so much work to do that we want everybody to have their own story of how they connect, where they feel empathy, and how they want to make a difference. So just allow yourself to kind of wonder, like, where is mine? Maybe it's one or two things, maybe it's 9. It's okay. It's yours. It's yours. And it's your roadmap. All right, so here's how do we manage your experience of climate anxiety? First, know that it's normal, expected. It means that you're connected. It means that things matter and that it activates something in you. The first thing that I recommend is sort of feel the feelings and then unpack your anxiety. Feelings are guideposts. And so as uncomfortable as they may be, as much as you'd rather not feel climate anxiety, allow yourself to feel it. Maybe even sort of take it out and put it on a table and say, what's behind this? Where is my hurt? Where is my fear? What is uniquely mine in these senses, in these different feelings? When you do that, you'll find your hurt and you'll find your path, your motivation. The second thing is exactly what you're doing right here, connect with others. It's so important to find support, connection, to share ideas, fears, and hopes. I'm part of the Climate Psychology Alliance, and on Saturday, we had just sort of put out just a general call to the membership and said, is anybody looking for support, and what would that look like? And we have about 60 people who are showing up for this just random Zoom meeting because people want to connect. I mean, we didn't even have an agenda or a particular clear goal or really a plan of any kind. We just said, does anybody want to talk? And all these people are showing up because they just want to connect. And so that's what I encourage you to do. Just like you're doing tonight, make a decision to connect. And then you can just say the things out loud that you're worried about and get validated in the fact that you're not alone. And I think that's, particularly when we've all been sort of wrestling with COVID for the last 2 years and we've spent more time alone than we typically do, to know that your ideas and your fears and your concerns are normal and they're shared and they're important. That helps so much. It doesn't take away the conditions that make you feel concerned, but it gives you hope because you're sitting with others who validate that. And then the third thing I recommend is sort of monitor your intake. And this is just the idea of, it's important that we know. It's important that we do our research, that we read and we study and we have conversations and we sort of face the facts and listen to yourself. If it's feeling like too much, it's okay to step back. And it's okay to then take some dosage of good stuff. Maybe if the sort of the dark and frightening parts of climate change, you've immersed yourself in it for a while. I'm reading a book called Paradise right now, which is about the California fires. I have to balance it. I have to balance it with a book that, it's called The Story of Hope. Jane Goodall, Counterbalance. I counterbalance. And so it's important to think like, how do I balance that so that I'm not hurting myself or wearing myself out with the heaviness, and I am seeing the other part as well. And that's where I sort of end almost ending, at this little phrase, which is one of my favorites, called radical hope. And there's a wonderful book called Radical Hope, and I'm not one of those people who can recall books and titles very well, so you'll just have to trust me. You can find it very easily. But Radical Hope is sort of based on this idea that over history, we've encountered some sort of massive culture shifts, or almost like civilization ending issues for different pockets of civilization, huge problems that we never imagined we could fix. And yet, somehow, over time, the ingenuity that was needed was developed and something got solved. But we didn't know how and didn't have the tools. And then over time, it happened. So we may, in fact, be in a situation, and I'll, I'm with you all. I'm pretty skeptical about this as well. But we may be holding a moment where we don't know the solution yet. And it could be just like that next thing out of reach. Or all of these undergrads that I work with here, one of them might know the thing, and they're just not ready yet. I am agreeing with you, time is ticking, and so I don't want to put too much there. But Radical Hope says, let's look at the severity of the problem and also know that we've solved things before. We really have. And to give yourself a little more energy in that we've solved things before, it's good to take some dosages of ingenuity, creativity, people who are doing things. So balance the reality and the intensity with people are coming up with some stuff. There's some really amazing books and videos that are showing the innovation, the creativity, if you spend any time listening to the youth movement in climate change, oh my gosh, I just don't even know. Like, it blows my mind, their thoughtfulness, their passion, their knowledge, their fierceness. They blow my mind. And in some of the darker times, I can watch a video from some of the kids in the youth movement and think, oh my gosh, there's something brewing in there that we never knew was happening. Radical hope, dark and light, hold both at the same time. I just like this. To me, when I read this, it says, I'm gonna let my heart break open. I am, because I don't want it to close to all of this stuff. Yeah, climate anxiety feels awful and terrifying. I talked to a woman today who left the United States for 6 weeks because she's been struggling with eco-anxiety and climate anxiety for a while, and the pandemic has just wore her down, and she's like, I don't want to ride out another wave of the pandemic when I'm still trying to recover or to find my footing with my climate anxiety. So she went to Costa Rica, and she's like in a hut, and she's like the coolest person I've ever met. But she said, I need to immerse myself in that dance between like the dark and light. And so I'm sitting in a hut in Costa Rica. Not all of us can do that, but it is important to realize that if my heart is cracked open, I can make some meaning of that. I can find something in there that's important. My heart didn't break open for no reason. It broke open so that it would never close again to the rest of the world. So this is me. If you ever need to find me, I'm at JMU. And I'm going to stop my share and see if anybody has any questions, comments, wonderings, anything. Love these conversations. So.
Thank you, Dr. Sturm. I'm just going to jump in. I'm going to allow everyone to start your video, and you are also going to be able to unmute yourselves. So if you prefer to ask the question out loud, you can. If you are more comfortable sharing in the chat, please feel free to do that as well.
We all think on it for a second. I will tell you that almost every time that I talk about climate change, particularly climate change and mental health, I tend to have a fairly quiet room because it's a lot to absorb and it's a lot to think about. And I know I throw a lot of things out there that I ask you to like really ponder and like take inside and do something with.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm sorry, I'm not doing my video. I'm kind of already, pajamaed up for the night.
That's
But
great.
I really enjoyed this talk, and thank you so much for it. And I guess this isn't a question. Well, maybe it is a little bit of a question, and I apologize. I missed the first few minutes, but just kind of, one thing that keeps coming up for me as you were talking is, oh, I'm not alone. Like sometimes I feel really alone. This eco anxiety I have and this like sadness. And then there's like rare bursts of light where I'm like, oh yeah, other people are thinking about this too. And I guess you probably answered this at the beginning, so my apologies, but how you came to this and kind of like how you plan to continue your own work and just like how you talk to, how you continue to spread the word, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. I'll tell you, one of the things that really propelled me, I think a lot of times, and this is sort of what propelled me, and maybe it'll resonate with me. I think advocacy, leadership, things like that always felt so out of reach and prescribed that you had to like do a thing. That you had to like be a specific kind of leader, that you had to do things in a way that like only certain people could do. And I realized, particularly in like working with undergrads and listening to their stories and even just reflecting their story back to them, that we just need to talk to each other. And the more we do that, there's just like a movement that happens. And so it took me a long time to feel like I had a voice and a place to talk to people so that they could talk to each other. And so I think, Caitlin, like if there's even a point where you're like, what, how do we do things with this? Like, I think like that connection is something that's always been so remarkable to me. And that even small gatherings, random gatherings, happenstance moments on a train are so powerful. And so for me, listening to people over time and listening to myself and just opening up the conversation is the thing that kind of has opened the door for all of the work that I'm doing now. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think the power of little things is really valid. Not discounting like minute clinical interactions like you're kind of addressing. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts?
Hi. So kind of in relation to just the little things, I feel like the thing that I keep coming up on is I'm like young, I'm like a stay-at-home mom, like I don't have a lot of extra time on my hands. I wish that I had like the expertise or the time to do more. But I try to focus on like, changing the habits within my own home and, kind of more lifestyle changes and stuff like that. And I think that they're valid, but that those things make such like a small dent in the actual problem. So I feel like it's hard not to get discouraged and be like, I want to like live my values and stuff like that. But because my contribution is so small, like what's the point?
Right.
So I don't know if you have any like advice on navigating those kinds of feelings.
Yeah, a million years ago, one of my professors we were sort of talking about sort of multicultural social justice issues, and it's like, oh gosh, like this is huge, this is overwhelming. Like, what in the world can I possibly do? And he said, you know what? You're a chip in a wall. And if you just go up there with your teeny little pick and you're like, and every couple of days you go and you go, and the next person does that, and the next person, you're going to destabilize the foundation. And so I think that a little chip in the wall is not a little chip in the wall. Every single thing that you do is part of a collective. It's part of everybody doing something. And I think if everybody found the thing that they can do that's theirs, we can crumble a wall, whatever that metaphorical wall is. Like, we can crumble it if we're all asking ourselves, like, what's the one thing I can do? So I hope, Ellen, that like you can think like, my chip matters. It might be the one that actually crumbles that part of the wall and opens us up to the sunlight. If we're all doing that, holy heck, like something will happen. I don't know if that resonates.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And I hope this is okay, Ellen. I was also just thinking as you were talking, so you may not feel like you're doing much, but as a mother, you're also showing your children this is how to live. So it's not just your life, you're also encouraging your children to take on these same things. So it's spreading what you are doing to next generations as well. So in that theme of the chipping, you're also spreading as well. So.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah. And Megan, I really appreciate you sort of connecting to the children aspect as well, because when we go back to that study of what kids are experiencing right now, the first one being betrayal. And for children and youth, they're looking up at people and systems and saying, y'all are failing us. When we need you most, you are not doing what we need. And so I think for parents, when you share those small things, seemingly small things, you're also planting seeds of reliability. Like, you're countering the narrative that everybody's failing us. You're being a person that's saying, like, I'm not failing you. I'm not big and powerful, but I am in your life. And you can really make, I don't know, I think at a time when kids are questioning if adults are making the right decisions for them, like, you have a chance to model it and prove them like somebody is. So. It's interesting working with, again, I teach at the PhD level, but I do a lot of things with undergrads here, and I take them on a study abroad every year, except for the last couple of years, to Malta, where we do environmental advocacy work, and we inevitably end up in these sort of like wine and chocolate conversations at like 10 o'clock at night in my room about just their futures and the things that they're learning. As somebody older than most of their parents, I really feel some of that sort of guilt and shame aspect as I hear them talk about their future. And I even feel kind of ridiculous sometimes of like, is there anything I can even really say, because they have been let down and they are really fearful in a way that I never had to feel at that age. And again, there's that value of sort of holding space for someone, like letting their concerns or their anger or their betrayal or their frustration or their sadness have space without a need for you to respond or fix it or anything, but just to like be there to hear them. And it really just strikes me sort of the difference between, somebody in my generation and their generation, and how important it is that we don't try to talk them out of their feelings, but instead just give them the space for them. So if you have young adults in your life, like, give them space, because they're wrestling with some heavy stuff that we didn't have to. Mhm. Sorry. Any other things lingering out there for you all? I can honestly talk for 2 weeks, and so that is unfortunate. So,
Dr. Sturm, I'll just ask, you mentioned one of the ways to sort of boost ourselves is to make connections. And I was wondering for us, especially since so many of us are at home right now, do you know of spaces? The library offers variety programs, so I encourage you to join us for those because we do have times for conversations. But do you know of other resources where people can connect and talk with others who may be sharing these same fears?
Yeah, so there's a couple options. Through the Climate Psychology Alliance, we train a lot of people who do climate cafes, and that is 100% just whoever wants to show up and talk. Typically 8 to 16 people with a facilitator. So if you do Google just climate cafes near me, you might be able to find those. Tend to be online right now. And you just never know who's going to show up, which, sometimes, like, as an introvert, that could feel a little unnerving, but as, like, as somebody who believes in conversation and connection, it's always interesting because, like, the people who are supposed to be there are the people who are there. And so you never know what can happen, but it's really a wonderful forum. So climate cafes. If you're really into climate change, the Climate Reality Project training with Al Gore is also online right now. It's a little bit of a heavy lift for a couple days, but then you get plugged into sort of a regional chapter, and the chapters meet monthly, and they just talk. I mean, sometimes they have speakers. Sometimes they decide they're going to do like a small advocacy project, but for the most part, they connect and share. And those have always been really cool. And we did a couple book clubs, and I'm not a book club person, but it was really cool to just sort of circle around a particular topic and have a space with like-minded and like emotional people who were wrestling with some of the emotional things too. So I recommend that as well. Climate Cafe is easy because right now everybody's doing them online, so you don't even have to connect locally. You can connect with somebody in Nebraska or wherever, and that's pretty interesting. It is kind of interesting to connect with people in diverse geographical locations because depending on where you live, climate change impacts you differently. So Climate Cafe and then the Climate Reality Project I found was really powerful and a really nice way to connect to like-minded climate people in our region.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right. Megan, is there anything else you think would be useful or helpful?
I think this has been wonderful. I actually really appreciate you bringing up the sort of the source of our anxiety and what it is that's causing us to have these feelings, because it's given me something to think about, because I sort of have these anxieties the more that I learn, but I had never really stopped to think about this is why I care about this in this way.
Yeah.
And I'm finding that really helpful to sort of focus on what it is that I want to do then. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I appreciate the resources that you provided for us. I think you've done a wonderful job. This has been really enjoyable and supportive. So I thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it is really interesting when you take the time to allow yourself to peel back the layers on what your thing is. Like for me, I'm such a sense of place person. I mean, places in my life, it's just it's like place is story, is identity to me. And even places that I love that I don't have, I love places in Oregon. We go on vacation there every year. It's like there's some soul connection for me. And when it burns, I just am crushed. I mean, it really hurts. And so it's okay to sort of even listen to pieces that like don't necessarily make sense. Like, why am I watched the movie Chasing Ice. My husband and I went to the theater in Charlottesville a gazillion years ago. I watched Chasing Ice. And if y'all haven't seen it, I can't recommend it highly enough. But it was about a glacier calving. And it was like the largest calving ever recorded. When that glacier started to break off, I burst into tears, like inexplicably. And I just was sobbing in the theater as if something had died, and it had. And so I think those are all important cues. What is really getting you? Because that's your path. That's where your stuff is. That's where your contribution is. So just trust that and see where it takes you.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Well, if there's no more thoughts and questions for Dr. Sturm, I want to thank you again for being with us tonight. This has been so enjoyable, and I'm glad that it's being recorded so I can come back and watch it again and pick up some of those things. And I just thank you for the work that you're doing, and I think it's wonderful, especially for us, as this is becoming something that we will have to be dealing with from now on. So So thank you so much, and thank you all who have joined on the call tonight for joining us.
Thanks.
All right, good night, everyone.